Hi there, this is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, and welcome to another episode of Double Take. Today's Double Take is not about Norman Jewison's In the Heat of the Night. This is about the two Mr. Tibbs sequels starring Sidney Poitier. Now on this 4K of In the Heat of the Night, you get They Call Me Mr. Tibbs, the 1970 sequel, and The Organisation from 1971, the third film in the trilogy. Now I wasn't even aware there was a trilogy. I had heard of They Call Me Mr. Tibbs, but I'd never seen it, and I wasn't aware that The Organisation was actually the third adventure, if you will, of Mr. Tibbs. Obviously In the Heat of the Night doesn't need any introduction, but in this one, Sidney Poitier's Mr. Tibbs is in Philadelphia. The two sequels relocate him to San Francisco. Now the first sequel, They Call Me Mr. Tibbs, 3 years later, the music's still by Quincy Jones, but Gordon Douglas takes over the directing from Jewison. I mean, Gordon Douglas, did Them, the giant ant film, amongst lots of other, a little bit of everything, basically a journeyman director. The third film, The Organisation, in 1971, was directed by Don Medford, again another kind of journeyman. But we'll start with They Call Me Mr. Tibbs, which is fairly mediocre. It's fairly lifeless. It kind of plays like an episode of Columbo almost. It's very studio bound. It looks like a TV show, essentially. We're introduced to a woman in her boudoir having an argument with somebody, and then she is later murdered. And Sidney Poitier investigates, and suspicion falls on his friend Martin Landau, who is a local minister, pastor, priest, I'm not quite sure, who's running for office. And it's all about the investigation to see whether Martin Landau is guilty or not. Granted, he's wanting to be in politics, and he's a minister, so you can make up your own conclusion whether he's guilty or not. It co-stars Anthony Zerbe, the wonderful Anthony Zerbe, and Ed Asner with a wonderful hairpiece. But we also see into Mr. Tibbs, or Lieutenant Tibbs' home life. His young daughter and son, played by a real-life brother and sister, and Barbara McNair plays Mrs. Tibbs in both films. And in this one, there's a lot about his son being difficult and how the family get around that. It becomes rather melodramatic. In the film itself, even Poitier looks not necessarily disinterested, but he doesn't look that engaged. I mean, they took 3 years to do a sequel. I'm not sure anybody really was desperate for a sequel. Obviously a TV show would come later, which was back in the setting of the original film. I mean, what's kind of good about the two sequels is the fact that race isn't really brought up. It's not really an issue. He's in San Francisco, and as we know, San Francisco is such a cool place that racism doesn't exist in San Francisco, or something like that. Because again, it is refreshing to see Sidney Poitier films that aren't about race, because obviously a lot of his films are. But if you watch The Bedford Incident with Richard Widmark and Eric Portman, That one's not about race either. That's just about nuclear submarines. So I wouldn't necessarily go out your way to see They Call Me Mr. Tibbs. It's fairly lackluster. As I said, fairly studio bound and feels like an episode of a TV show, basically. But the organisation from 1971 is far more interesting, to me anyway. Well, Quincy Jones doesn't do the music for this one, but it's got a nice little score, and the first 10 minutes is a really involved and well detailed robbery of a factory, and we see this kind of multi-racial gang who has obviously brought somebody along who works for the office to open a safe or a vault for them. It's very well planned, including pole vaulting and other such things. And somebody is killed, and Mr. Tibbs, or Lieutenant Tibbs, is brought in to investigate, and it turns out that it's a gang who want to take down the organisation, or the mafia, by, in this factory is a front for drugs. So they have ripped off the mafia and enlist the help of Sidney Poitier to actually bring these guys down. Now obviously we get an idea through phone calls and business meetings that the organisation is spread in different countries. So will Sidney Poitier and his bunch of amigos and misfits be able to bring down the entire organised crime? Again, it is made in 1971, so it's far more realistic. It has an amazing cast if you watch a lot of American TV from the 70s. It has Alan Garfield as Bernie Hamilton, or the captain from Starsky and Hutch, who did a lot of shouting. It has a young Raul Julia, who's quite wonderful. He just looks so young. Daniel J. Travanti, who bizarrely while I was watching it I got his name right, including the initial. Obviously more famous than Hill Street Blues. It's got Billy Green Bush as kind of the leader of this multiracial group. There's Gary Wahlberg, who you'll probably recognise as Monahan from Quincy. He's in both as one of the Poitier's colleagues. Ron O'Neill, who's Superfly, he's one of the gang. So it's just a who's who of 70s television and 70s American films. But again, it has this nasty edge. One of the bosses in the organisation featured in an episode of Kolchak as a conductor who had a deadly doppelganger, if you're a fan of Kolchak. So it's full of wonderful faces. Poitier obviously has the dilemma of helping these crazy kids out or turning them in, which is a nice kind of moral dilemma for him. Because again, we view Sidney Poitier and Lieutenant Tibbs as this paragon of the law, but he may bend it to try and help these crazy kids take down the mafia. But as you can probably guess, it's perhaps not everybody's going to get out of this alive. There's exciting chase scenes. There's less on his family. The daughter doesn't really feature in it too much. The son is obviously a year older because it's the same actors again. The good thing about these sequels is it's pretty much the same group of actors playing Sidney Poitier's family and his colleagues on the force. But his son is just discovering sex, and Poitier, is trying to do the fatherly thing. He's learning about smoking, so there's a wonderful scene where Poitier smokes a cigar with his son and forces his son to finish it. But there's less of the domestic side than there was in the first sequel. They call him Mr. Tibbs, which is a good thing because that kind of bogged it down, to be perfectly honest. So the second, the organisation, the second sequel certainly moves a lot faster. There's less padding in it. It's less studio bound. There's a lot of location work in San Francisco. It feels more like a film rather than an episode of television that's just been stretched out for like an hour and a half. And again, it does remind one of a little bit of Across 110th Street, which would come out in 1972, the year after, as far as people ripping off the mob and then also the consequences and repercussions of that. It also reminds you a little bit of Magnum Force, the Dirty Harry sequel. Not Magnum Force, sorry, the Enforcer. The Dirty Harry sequel, where again these group of multiracial terrorists are taking over San Francisco. But it's lovely because there's a scene where he's talking to this gang and they all kind of tell him how their lives were affected by drugs and deaths in their family, like their younger brother or their younger sister. So that's why they're doing it. So we learn their motivations for trying to clean the streets of drugs, because again they're claiming the police aren't doing anything about it. The police are on the take. Obviously this is 1971, so there's a lot of youth dissatisfaction, and this film captures part of that. So as kind of mediocre and turgid the first sequel is, the organisation it's got a little bit of pep in its step, a little bit of glide in its stride, and it has a much better energy than They Call Me Mr. Tibbs. So all in all, I would recommend you pick up the 4K of In the Heat of the Night because it looks really good. But I think for the price, it is really nice to actually have the two sequels on Blu-ray, also Region A Blu-ray. And yes, as I say, They Call Me Mr. Tibbs perhaps isn't the greatest film in the world, because it's not, far from it. But the organisation is certainly well worth a look if that sounds like it might be up your street. So thanks very much for watching. Please let me know if you've seen They Call Me Mr. Tibbs or the organisation, or if you were even aware that the organisation was a part of a trilogy. I'm guessing the Mr. Tibbs trilogy doesn't really come up in the greatest trilogies of all time very often. It probably certainly wouldn't be because of the middle episode or the middle film, but it's well worth a little look. So thanks so much for watching. This is Solitary Ronin from Solitary Ronin Films, saying farewell.